The file begins with a contradiction. FC. Luther Herschel's story is recorded as dead, his name etched beside a Medal of Honor. Yet his body never came home. For 70 years, a grave marked X260 Tangok held a man without a name, while a name lived without a grave. Judy Wade, his niece, grew up touching certainty instead of remains. A folded flag, a citation read aloud. They told us he was gone, she remembers. That was supposed to be enough. I can't pretend I know what it felt like to inherit praise without proof. A dpaa investigator lifts a brittle tag. Gwendolyn Story Chambliss once held a letter that said nothing more. Somewhere between honor and earth, a hero disappeared and waited. The cotton fields outside Plains, Georgia, stretched low and pale beneath the late summer sun. By August, the bolls had split wide, sharp at the edges, clinging to the fingers of anyone who moved too fast. Luther Herschel's story moved anyway. Bend, pull, twist, drop. The rhythm was older than he was, passed down without ceremony. His sack dragged heavier with each row, the strap biting into his shoulder. By mid-morning, the pads of his fingers had split open. Blood traced thin lines into the white fiber, then dried, dark, and stiff. He wiped his hands against his trousers and kept going. Stopping meant falling behind. Falling behind meant fewer pounds weighed at day's end. When the sun slid low, Luther followed the same routine he had every evening. He set the cotton sack against the porch rail, unlaced his boots, and filled a dented tin basin with water from the pump. The first splash stung. He scrubbed with lye soap until the skin burned clean, until the water clouded and turned faintly pink. Inside the house, the smell of boiled beans and cornbread drifted through the open door. Florence Story, his mother, stood at the stove, stirring slowly. Her shoulders rounded from years of bending the same way he had all day. "You're gonna wash those raw," she said, not turning around. "They heal," Luther replied. It wasn't defiance. It was something he had proven. The house held little that wasn't worn. A table with one short leg, chairs that rocked if you leaned back too far. In the narrow bedroom Luther had once shared with his brother, a baseball glove lay folded under the bed, leather creased to the shape of his left hand. He hadn't played in months. The field behind the school had gone to weeds, and work came first. Still, every night, he nudged the glove with his foot, just to feel it there. The habit mattered, even if the game no longer did. Luther was 18, old enough to know the fields would never loosen their grip, young enough to believe there might be another way out. At the feed store, he listened to men talk about the army. Steady meals, boots that fit, pay that came on time. He listened without speaking, weighing each word against the sound of his mother coughing before dawn. The quiet way his sister counted coins at the table. That night, after supper, he said it. He waited until Florence sat down, until Gwendolyn Story Chambliss finished rinsing the plates. "I'm thinking about enlisting," Luther said. The room went still, except for the hum of insects outside. Gwendolyn stopped drying and set the towel on the counter. Florence looked up slowly. "You're not old enough. I will be soon." "Soon isn't enough," she said. "Why now?" Luther looked at his hands, clean but throbbing. "Because I don't want to do this forever." They talked late. Florence paced the length of the room, counting steps without meaning to. She spoke of neighbors' boys who had gone off and sent money home folded into letters. She spoke of danger without naming it. Luther spoke of learning a trade, of sending something back so she wouldn't have to bend quite so long in the fields. Gwendolyn watched the clock, aware that once the words were spoken, the night seemed to move faster. At last, Florence sat and picked up the form Luther had brought home. The paper crackled in her hands. She read the line twice. "The birth year," she said. Luther nodded. "It's 1 year." Her pen hovered. "This is a lie." "I know." The scratch of the pen was loud in the small kitchen. Gwendolyn turned away, pressing the towel to her face. Years later, she would remember that sound more clearly than anything else from that night. The morning Luther left, the air was cool and damp. He packed little: socks, a pressed shirt, a folded note in his mother's careful handwriting. Before stepping out, he reached under the bed and touched the glove once, then left it where it was. Outside, Gwendolyn stood at the edge of the yard, arms crossed tight against herself. "Right," she said. "I will." Don't forget us." "I won't," he answered, trying to smile. "I can't pretend I know what it felt like to watch a younger brother walk down a dirt road with his shoulders squared, knowing the house would never sound the same again. I do know how small decisions, the movement of a pen, the place an object is left, can travel farther than anyone expects." Training changed Luther quickly. He learned to rise before dawn, to fold his blanket tight, to take orders without argument. He learned the weight of a weapon and the discipline of waiting. In letters home, he asked about the crops and reminded Florence to rest. He told Gwendolyn he was fine. He didn't write about fear. He wrote about work. By late summer of 1950, he was overseas with Company A, 1st Battalion, 9th Infantry Regiment. The heat pressed heavier than Georgia's. The ground soft and cut by water. On the morning of September 1st, Luther checked his gear the way he always did, straps tight. Ammunition counted twice. He shared a cigarette with another soldier and joked about food back home. "After this," someone said, "I'm sleeping a week straight." Luther grinned. "After this, I'm eating till I'm sick." It was an ordinary exchange, the kind men used to keep fear at arm's length. When the order came to pull back, Luther moved without hesitation. He saw the gap opening as the company withdrew. When the machine gunner went down, Luther took the weapon and fired until the barrel burned his hands. When an enemy truck pushed forward, he ran toward it with grenades, waving others down. "Get back!" he shouted. He crawled through mud to bring more grenades forward, returned again and again until the vehicle burned and stopped. Later, wounded and slowing, he made one more choice. He told the others to keep moving. "I'll cover you," he said. They last saw him firing steadily, planted in place, drawing the enemy toward himself. That was the final moment anyone could describe with certainty. The fields in Georgia were far away, then the tin basin, the glove under the bed, the lie written carefully on a form. What remained was routine carried to its last edge, and a young man who understood, perhaps too late or exactly in time, that habit and resolve could hold a line when nothing else would. The last clear sighting of Luther Herschel's story came through smoke, distance, and confusion. Men from Company A remembered him standing when others were already moving, planted behind the machine gun, as the order to withdraw rippled down the line. Someone shouted his name. Someone else swore they heard him answer. Then the sound of firing swallowed everything else. By the time the company reached its next position, Luther was no longer among them. There was no body recovered, no helmet pulled from the mud, no identification tags found along the churned ground near the river. The area where he had last been seen was cut off before nightfall, swallowed again by enemy movement. The next morning, the line shifted once more, and whatever chance there had been to look for him closed without ceremony. The company commander, exhausted and bleeding from a shallow wound of his own, filed his report before dawn. He wrote that Private First Class Story had been last observed covering the retreat, wounded but continuing to engage the enemy. He wrote that further search was impossible due to the tactical situation. The language was precise, stripped of everything but fact. What it did not record was that he had waited longer than doctrine advised, listening for one more burst of gunfire, one more sign that Story might still be moving. The report moved up the chain. Within days, it landed on the desk of a Graves registration officer assigned to the sector. He worked from a folding table under canvas, maps spread wide, names penciled into margins already crowded with dates and coordinates. For some men, there were tags, effects, witnesses. For Story, there was only a last seen location and a note, covering withdrawal. The officer marked the space beside his name with a symbol he used too often, folded the page, and reached for the next file. The work allowed no hesitation. Back in Georgia, the first letter arrived thin and official. Florence Story recognized the envelope before she opened it. She sat at the table, hands flat, and read the words slowly. Her son was listed as wounded in action. No location, no details. She read it again, then folded it carefully and set it beside her plate. "He's alive," she said into the quiet room. Her daughter Gwendolyn stood at the sink, hands in water, listening to the scrape of porcelain. She wanted to ask how badly he was hurt, where he might be, when they would hear again. She didn't ask. She dried her hands and stepped outside. Sitting on the porch steps and staring down the dirt road, as if he might come walking back along it. Weeks passed. The second letter came, heavier in her hands though the paper was the same. The wording had changed. Missing in action. Florence's fingers trembled as she read. She went to the drawer where she kept Luther's earlier letters and placed the new notice beside the old one, aligning the corners as if order might make sense of it. "Missing isn't dead," she said, more to herself than anyone else. Gwendolyn nodded, though she felt the weight of the words settle anyway. "I can't pretend I know what it felt like to live between those two phrases, wounded and missing with nothing but time in between. There's a kind of waiting that doesn't shout or collapse. It settles into routines. An extra place set at the table. A road watched every afternoon. A radio turned up at night in case a name is read aloud. Florence wrote letters she never mailed. She asked about hospitals, about prisoner lists, about units moving south and north across a country she had never seen. When no answers came, she folded the pages and slid them back into the drawer. At night, she replayed the moment she signed the enlistment form, the pen scratching across the birth year. She wondered if that small lie had followed him, marking him in ways she could not see. Gwendolyn took over the chores Luther used to do. She carried water from the pump, split kindling, and avoided the bedroom where his things still lay. The baseball glove remained under the bed, exactly where he had left it. Once, while sweeping, she nudged it by accident and froze. Broom suspended in midair. She pushed it back with her foot and finished the room quickly, breath shallow. At the army's end, Luther's status shifted again, from missing to presumed dead. The notice arrived years later, the date stamped neatly at the top. Florence read it without sitting down. The words were final but unspecific, offering condolences without explanation. "There's no place," Gwendolyn said quietly, reading over her shoulder. Florence shook her head. Not yet. She kept all the papers together, the training letters, the first notice, the second, and now this one. She read them in order, as if sequence might reveal something official language could not. Across the ocean, the land where Luther had last been seen changed hands again. Months later, when the area was retaken, Graves registration teams moved through low hills and riverbanks, probing shallow graves and marked sites. 11 sets of remains were recovered near crossings and ridgelines. 8 could be identified by tags or personal effects. 3 could not. One of those sets was catalogued as X260. Location noted as Tangok. The remains were incomplete, weathered by exposure and time. There was nothing with them that carried a name. At the identification center in Japan, technicians examined teeth, measured bones, and compared what they could to records that were already thin. Dental charts were partial. Fingerprints unavailable. They worked methodically, then marked the file. Unknown. The designation did not imply neglect. It marked a boundary. Without conclusive proof, the remains could not be assigned. X260 was placed among others like it, boxed carefully, labeled clearly, and transferred for burial. The process followed regulation. Regulation did not account for Florence Story sitting at her table, reading the same lines over and over. Years went by. Florence spoke Luther's name less often, not because she forgot it, but because saying it sharpened the waiting. Gwendolyn married and moved away, carrying the memory with her. On visits home, she glanced at the drawer where the letters were kept and then looked away. At the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, a marker bearing the code X260 was set among many others. The grass grew evenly around it, trimmed and green. Nearby, on the wall of the missing, Luther Herschel Story's name was carved in stone. Name and body rested within the same cemetery, separated by certainty and earth, neither aware of the other. A Graves registration officer noted the placement in a ledger, closed the book, and moved on. For him, the task was complete. For the Story family, it was not. Florence died without knowing where her son lay. The drawer of letters passed to Gwendolyn, who kept them intact. When she had a daughter, Judy, she told her about the uncle who never came home. She did not tell her, at first, about the pen scratching across the wrong year. This wasn't a statistic. This was someone's son, someone's brother, reduced by circumstance and paperwork to a shifting line on a form. By the time decades had passed, Luther's life had hardened into two parallel truths: a hero honored for what he did, and a body unaccounted for. Between them stretched years of forms, ledgers, and families learning how to set the table for fewer people and call it living. And beneath trimmed grass in Hawaii, X260 remained, while a family learned how to wait without expecting an answer. The decision did not begin with Luther Story's name. It began with a map. Inside a conference room at Joint Base Pearl Harbor-Hickam, a laminated aerial image of the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific lay spread across a long table. Rows were numbered. Sections were color-coded. Beneath the neat geometry sat hundreds of men whose records had ended without certainty. A dpaa forensic lead, sleeves rolled to the forearms, traced a finger across one quadrant and stopped. "This cluster," he said. "High probability. Multiple unknowns from the same engagement." Someone else leaned in. "What makes it move now?" "Better tools," the lead replied. "And better matches." They weren't reopening grief for the sake of curiosity. They were following a strategy. Prioritize unknowns with the strongest paper trails, the tightest windows of loss, the fewest variables left unresolved. Among those markers sat one with a code that had been copied by hand for decades. X260. The file was thin but stubborn. A recovery near a river crossing. A time frame compressed into a single day. A unit known. A man last seen holding a line, alone. On another island, in a quiet house far from the cemetery, Judy Wade folded laundry at the kitchen table. The radio murmured news she half heard. The afternoon light fell across a framed photograph of a young man in uniform. Her uncle, Luther, sat beside a folded flag. She had grown up with that arrangement. It had always been there, as fixed as the walls. Her phone rang. An unfamiliar number. She let it ring once, twice. Then she answered. "Miss Wade?" a man asked. His voice was careful. "My name is I'm calling from the Defense POW and MIA accounting agency." Judy sat down. "Yes," she said, already gripping the edge of the table. "We're reviewing remains recovered from the Korean War," he continued. "There's a set cataloged as X260. Based on the records, we believe there's a possibility it could be your uncle." The word possibility hung between them. Judy closed her eyes. "You're saying you don't know?" "That's correct," he said. "We don't know yet." Quote, "Disable in the Delary to the Nengsten. Delary 1 Dodd." After the call ended, she stayed seated for a long time. The laundry lay untouched. She thought of her mother, Gwendolyn, and the drawer of letters she had kept. She thought of the years when certainty had been painful but stable. Now it was shifting again. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to be offered hope with conditions attached. There's a particular strain to it, the way it asks you to reopen rooms you've already learned to live around." At Punch Bowl, the exhumation began at dawn. The team moved quietly, deliberately. Grass was cut back, soil lifted in measured layers. Each action was logged, photographed, checked by another set of eyes. A chaplain stood off to one side, hands folded, watching without speaking. When the first fragments appeared, the forensic lead paused. "Slow it down," he said. "Everything matters from here." The remains were transferred to a temporary lab on base. Each piece was cleaned, catalogued, placed on a sterile surface. A technician held a bone fragment up to the light, turning it gently. "Age range looks young," she said. The lead nodded. "Younger than the paperwork." That discrepancy was noted, then circled. It didn't prove anything. It didn't disprove anything either. Back in Georgia, Judy told herself not to speculate. She went about her days as usual: morning coffee, a walk around the block, the familiar route through the grocery store. Friends asked why she seemed distracted. She said she was tired. At night, she took out the photograph of Luther and studied it more closely than she had in years, noting the angle of his smile, the way his uniform hung on his shoulders. "I hope you're ready," she whispered once, surprised by her own voice. Weeks passed. Another call came, then another. Each brought updates without conclusions. Dental comparisons suggested alignment, but not certainty. Bone measurements fit within a range that overlapped with other missing men. The file thickened, but the answer did not arrive. In the lab, an AFMES analyst prepared a sample for mitochondrial DNA testing. She worked under bright lights, hands steady. "If we get a match," she said to a colleague, "it won't just confirm him. It'll explain the confusion." "How so?" "The age," the analyst said. "The records say one thing. Biology might say another. If you are prosebetter." The sample was sealed and sent for comparison. Judy was asked if she would be willing to provide a reference. She said yes without hesitation. The kit arrived by mail, neatly packaged with instructions printed in plain language. She swabbed the inside of her cheek, sealed the envelope, and held it for a moment before sending it off. "This feels strange," she told a friend later. "Like I'm mailing a piece of myself into the past. How in any 5R? And in the rouse. I can't pretend I know what it's like to carry a family's history in your cells and be asked to prove it. What I do know is that waiting becomes different once your body is involved." The lab went quiet after that. Not empty, just focused. Results take time. Quality control requires repetition. No one rushed it. Outside the building, planes lifted and landed, schedules kept. Inside, technicians moved with the patience of people who knew what delay cost. When the call finally came, it was early. "Miss Wade," the casualty officer said, voice steady. "We have results." Judy sat on the edge of her bed. "Okay. The mitochondrial DNA comparison shows a match," he said. "The remains cataloged as X260 are those of your uncle, Luther Herschel Story." She did not cry right away. She pressed her palm against the mattress, grounding herself. "So he wasn't lost," she said quietly. "No," the officer replied. "He was here." Asquilation. After the call, Judy walked outside and stood in the yard. The grass needed cutting. The air was warm. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower started up, the sound ordinary and jarring at once. She called her mother's old number out of habit, then stopped herself. Instead, she sat back down and took out the photograph, placing it face up on the table. "They found you," she said. "It took a long time." At Punch Bowl, the marker bearing X260 was removed. The grass beneath it was pale, unaccustomed to light. The forensic lead watched as the space was filled, the ground smoothed. "Put his name back where it belongs," he said. This wasn't a moment of triumph. It was a transfer of responsibility from code to name, from ledger to family. The investigation had shifted the balance, but it hadn't erased the years that came before. For Judy, the days that followed were a careful rearrangement. Phone calls, paperwork, decisions about timing and place. She found herself explaining the story to people who nodded respectfully, then returned to their own routines. Late one evening, she sat alone and unfolded the flag that had been kept for decades. She ran her fingers along the crease, the fabric cool and familiar. "I wish you could have come home sooner," she said aloud. The discovery had answered one question without softening the rest. Luther's Story had been located, identified, and claimed. What remained was the long work of understanding what that meant for those who had lived without him, and how a name, once separated from a body, could finally be brought back into alignment without closing the distance entirely. The laboratory did not look like the place where history changed. There were no flags on the walls, no photographs of men in uniform, just stainless steel tables, bright lights, and a quiet that came from concentration rather than reverence. Here, X260 was not a hero or a symbol. It was a collection of fragments, laid out carefully, each one labeled, measured, and handled with gloved hands. A dpaa forensic anthropologist stood over the table, clipboard tucked under one arm. She had spent years learning how to read bones the way others read handwriting. Growth lines, wear patterns, subtle asymmetries, each told a story if you knew where to look. "You see this," she said to a colleague, indicating the collarbone. "Incomplete fusion." The colleague leaned closer. "Younger than the records." "Yes," the anthropologist replied. "Not by much, but enough." The official paperwork said Luther Herschel's Story had been born a year earlier than he truly was. On paper, he should have been slightly older at the time of death. The bones suggested otherwise. Not dramatically, not conclusively, but persistently. This was not proof. It was friction, and friction mattered. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to argue with history using fragments of a body, but there's a particular weight in knowing that a young man once lied to enter the army, and that lie may have followed him into the ground, confusing those who tried to find him later. Dental charts came next. Old, faded forms pulled from archives and scanned into modern systems. The original impressions were rough, taken quickly during intake, never meant to carry this much responsibility. Still, the AFMS dental consultant overlaid them against the remains. There's alignment here, she said, tapping the screen. A filling that matches the placement. But the chart's incomplete. So we can't say yes, the anthropologist replied. And we can't say no, the consultant said. That was the pattern. Every method narrowed the field without closing it. Bone age leaned younger. Dental work leaned toward a match. Context unit, location, timing leaned heavily in one direction. But none of it, alone, crossed the threshold required to remove the word unknown from the file. Outside the lab, time moved normally. Inside, it slowed. The mitochondrial DNA sample sat in a freezer, logged and waiting its turn. Unlike nuclear DNA, which could pinpoint an individual, mitochondrial DNA traced maternal lines. It would not say, "This is Luther's story." It would say, "This person belongs to this family." Enough to identify if the family reference matched. The DNA analyst prepared the extraction with ritual precision. She worked without speaking, the hum of equipment filling the space. Once the sample was ready, she labeled it and set it aside. "This part always feels heavier," she said later, to no one in particular. "Because if it matches, it changes a lot of people's lives. And if it doesn't, it still does." Back in Georgia, Judy Wade waited. She tried to keep busy, but the waiting threaded itself through everything. Grocery aisles, church pews, even sleep. She found herself thinking about details she had never questioned before her uncle's age, the way her mother used to hesitate before answering questions about him. She took the old letters out again, laying them across the table in order. Training notes, early updates, the final notice. She noticed how often Luther wrote about routine weather, meals, guard duty. He never wrote about danger directly. It struck her that he might have believed routine could protect him. "I think you liked order," she said to the photograph, "even when nothing else made sense. I can't pretend I know what it's like to wait for science to confirm a loss you've already lived with, but there's a difference between grief assumed and grief proven. One settles, the other reopens." In the lab, the DNA results came back late in the day. The analyst reviewed them twice, then once more with a colleague. She cross-checked the maternal reference sample provided by Judy. The sequences aligned. She exhaled slowly and reached for the phone. The dpaa forensic lead gathered the team the next morning. He did not raise his voice. "The mitochondrial DNA matches the family reference," he said. "Combined with the anthropological and dental data, we can make a positive identification." No one cheered. A few people nodded. One technician closed her eyes for a moment, then returned to her notes. "This means the age discrepancy makes sense," the anthropologist added. "The lie about his birth year helped him get in," the lead finished, "and helped hide him later." The file was updated. X260 was crossed out, replaced with a name that had been waiting decades to be written in the right place. The paperwork moved carefully. Checks within checks. Peer review. Final authorization. Each step ensured that when the family was told, the answer would hold. When the call came to Judy, it was direct. "We have confirmed the identification," the officer said. "It is your uncle, Luther Herschel's story." Judy pressed her hand to her chest. "So the waiting is over," she said. "Yes," he replied. "The identification is complete." After the call, she sat quietly. Relief came first, sharp and surprising. Then something heavier followed close behind, a grief she realized had been postponed, not avoided. She thought of her grandparents, both gone now, of her mother, who had carried the story without resolution, of the way official language had shaped their lives. "They didn't know where you were," she said softly. "But they never stopped believing you mattered." At the cemetery, preparations began to remove the marker, bearing the code. The grounds crew worked carefully, lifting it straight up, placing it aside. The earth beneath was pale, unmarked by sunlight. The forensic lead watched, hands clasped behind his back. "This is the moment people think they're waiting for," he said to a colleague. "But it's only one step." The reconstruction was complete. The science had done its work. But science did not explain the cost of 70 years. It could not return conversations never had, or erase the weight of a lie told out of necessity. What it could do, what it had done, was give a name back to a body, and a body back to a family. The rest would be carried by people, not evidence. The call came on a weekday morning, the kind that still carries errands and plans. Judy Wade was standing at the counter, coffee cooling in her mug. when the phone rang again. She recognized the number this time. She took a breath before answering, as if the pause could steady what followed. "Miss Wade," the military casualty officer said, his voice formal but gentle. "The identification has been approved. The remains formerly catalogued as X260 have been confirmed as Private First Class Luther Herschel Story." Judy closed her eyes. She didn't sit down. She pressed her palm flat to the counter, feeling the cool laminate under her skin. "So it's finished," she said. "The identification is complete," he replied. "We can begin arrangements to return him home." Home. The word landed differently now. It wasn't a place on a map. It was a direction that had been missing. After the call ended, Judy stood still for a long moment. The house was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed, tires whispering over pavement. Ordinary sounds, unchanged by the fact that a 70-year wait had just been given a name and an end date. I can't pretend I know what it feels like when certainty finally arrives and brings more weight instead of less. There's a particular kind of relief that doesn't lift you, it pins you in place until you understand what you're holding. She called family next, cousins, a pastor, an old friend of her mother's who still remembered the letters coming and then stopping. Each conversation followed the same arc. Surprise, a long pause, then gratitude edged with something raw. "So they really found him," one cousin said. "Yes," Judy answered. "They did." "And your mama?" the woman began, then stopped. "I know," Judy said. "I know." That night, Judy took out the Medal of Honor citation she had seen so many times she could recite parts of it from memory. The paper was thick, the language formal, listing actions taken under fire. She read it slowly, line by line, imagining the young man it described, not as a figure charging forward, but as her uncle, who had once left a baseball glove under a bed in Georgia. She set the citation beside the photograph and studied the two together. Honor and absence, finally sharing the same space. Arrangements moved quickly, carefully. Forms were signed, dates discussed. A decision had to be made about where Luther would be buried. Judy chose Andersonville, close enough to the places his life had begun. The choice felt right, even if it came decades late. When the casket arrived in Georgia, it was met with quiet precision. A senior U.S. officer stood at attention as it was transferred, the flag folded tight across the top. Judy watched from a few steps back, hands clasped, noting how the metal handles caught the light. "He's home," the officer said softly to her. "Yes," she replied. "He is." The funeral drew people Judy had never met. Neighbors, veterans, officials who knew Luther's name only through a file. A South Korean military representative approached her before the service, bowing slightly. "Your uncle's sacrifice matters to my country," he said. "We remember." One hymn. Judy nodded, surprised by how personal the words felt. "Thank you for saying that." During the service, the citation was read aloud. The language was unchanged, but the context was different now. The words settled into the room with weight, not as proclamation, but as explanation. When the flag was folded and presented, Judy accepted it with both hands. "This belongs to him," she said quietly, then corrected herself. "It belongs to all of us." No frest. Afterward, she walked alone for a few minutes, moving past headstones and trimmed grass. She stopped beside Luther's grave, now marked with his name. She placed her hand on the earth. "You took care of everyone else," she said, voice low. "I wish someone could have taken care of you sooner." There was no answer, but there didn't need to be one. The truth had arrived, and it carried its own sound, a steady, grounding finality that didn't erase the past, but allowed it to settle. Later, as people began to leave, Judy remained seated for a while. She watched the wind move the flags nearby, fabric snapping once before easing again. She thought of her grandparents, of her mother, of the years spent living with a story that had never quite landed. The identification had not brought them back. It had not shortened the distance of time. What it had done was return ownership of the loss from paperwork and codes to the people who had carried it quietly. I can't pretend I know what closure means in a case like this, but I can see what truth does when it finally has a place to stand. It lets grief become specific. It lets love rest on something solid. As Judy stood to leave, She looked once more at the marker, then at the folded flag in her hands. The waiting was over. The living would have to decide what to do with that, day by day, in the ordinary ways that matter most. The morning of the burial at Andersonville arrived warm and clear, the kind of Georgia day that carries sound easily. Tires crunched on gravel as cars lined up outside the gates. A breeze lifted the tops of the pines and carried the smell of cut grass across the cemetery. Flags stood in even rows, fabric snapping once before settling again. The casket was moved slowly, borne by uniformed hands that had practiced this motion many times. The flag covering it was tight, its folds sharp. Judy Wade walked a few steps behind, holding a small program printed on thick paper. Her thumb traced the edge without her noticing, a habit she had picked up during long meetings and longer waits. A senior U.S. officer stepped forward to open the ceremony. His voice carried clearly. "We are here to return Private First Class Luther Herschel Story to his place among his own," he said. "This is not a recovery. This is a homecoming. If you made her 7." The words were measured, rehearsed, but they landed with weight. To one side stood a South Korean military representative, his uniform immaculate, his posture formal. When his turn came, he spoke briefly, then bowed toward the casket. "We live in safety because of men like him," he said. "My country remembers." Judy nodded once, hands tightening around the program. She had heard similar words before, but never spoken this close to the ground where her uncle would rest. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to watch a personal loss take on national meaning. There's a moment when the story no longer belongs only to the family, and you have to decide how to stand inside that." As the service continued, Judy's mind drifted to details she had not shared with anyone yet. A memory her mother had once told her quietly, almost as an aside. When Luther was a teenager, before the talk of enlistment, he used to rise early on Sundays and walk to the edge of the property with a pocket knife and a length of twine. He would fix loose fence wire without being asked, humming to himself. It wasn't heroic. It was just something he did so the cows wouldn't wander. That small habit had never made it into a citation or a report. It had stayed in the family, unrecorded, until now. When the time came for the flag presentation, the officer knelt and held it out to Judy with both hands. The cloth was cool, heavier than it looked. "On behalf of a grateful nation," he said. Judy accepted it, her grip steady. "Thank you," she replied, her voice quieter than she expected. After the ceremony, people lingered. Some approached Judy to shake her hand. Others stood back, unsure. A few veterans saluted the grave before turning away. The South Korean representative returned once more. "I hope it is all right," he said, "but I would like to tell my children about him." Judy swallowed. "Yes," she said, "please do." As the crowd thinned, Judy remained. The cemetery returned to its normal sounds: wind, distant traffic, birds settling back into the trees. She knelt and placed her hand on the fresh earth. "You always fix things early," she said softly. "I think you would have liked this quiet." Minus Diddy. She noticed a small detail then, a patch of soil slightly darker where the grass had been lifted and replaced. It would even out with time. Everything did, eventually. The story did not end at the grave. In the weeks that followed, Luther's name appeared in places Judy had never expected. Press releases, speeches, diplomatic statements. His photograph was displayed behind podiums. His citation quoted in rooms where decisions were made about alliances and defense. His life, once reduced to a code, now carried symbolic weight far beyond Georgia. A state official called to ask permission to reference him at an event. "Of course," Judy said, after a pause. "Just say his name right." "We will," the official promised. "I can't pretend I know how it feels to watch a loved one become an emblem. There's pride in it, yes, but also a quiet fear that the human edges might be smoothed away." Judy returned home and placed the folded flag on a shelf beside the photograph and the citation. She added something new: a small coil of twine she had found in her mother's old sewing box, saved for reasons no one had written down. She knew, suddenly, exactly where it belonged. Friends asked if she felt peace now. "I feel settled," she told one of them. "That's different." At Andersonville, visitors sometimes stopped at Luther's grave after reading about him elsewhere. They stood for a moment, then moved on. The grounds crew trimmed the grass. Seasons shifted. The marker stayed. The dpaa forensic lead received a brief update confirming the burial was complete. He closed the file and placed it in storage. Another case moved forward. Another code waited its turn. Still, on some evenings, he thought about the age discrepancy, the way a single year on paper had rippled outward for decades. He remembered the collarbone under the lab lights, the quiet nod when the data finally aligned. "Worth it," he said once, aloud, to an empty office. For Judy, life returned to routine slowly. She resumed her walks, her grocery trips, her quiet mornings. But now, when she passed the framed photograph, she stopped. She no longer felt the need to imagine where her uncle might be. One afternoon, she took the baseball glove, the same one her mother had finally given her after clearing the house, and set it on the table. The leather was dry, but intact. She slid her hand into it. It still fit. "You kept things longer than you needed to," she said, half smiling. "I guess I do too." She placed the glove back on the shelf, beside the twine and the flag. What remained was not a lesson or a slogan. It was a set of choices made by people at different moments. A mother signing a form, a young man stepping forward, a commander waiting one breath longer, a scientist refusing to rush a result, a niece answering a phone call she almost let ring. In the end, Luther Herschel's story did not return as he left. He returned as something heavier and quieter, a name reunited with a body, a habit remembered alongside a medal, a life restored to its proper scale. The grave was marked now. The ground held steady, and for the first time in more than 70 years, the story did not need to move anymore. The house in Plains, Georgia, stands quieter now than it ever did when Luther lived there. The yard has changed shape, the trees are taller, but the road out front still gathers dust the same way it did when a young man walked down it carrying more resolve than luggage. No one waits on the porch anymore. The waiting moved on without announcing itself. At Andersonville, the marker bearing Luther Herschel's story's name rests among others, clean and legible. Visitors pause, read, and continue on. The ground does not tell them about cotton bolls cutting fingers, or a baseball glove left under a bed, or a mother staring at a drawer of letters she could never organize into peace. Judy Wade visits when she can. She stands, sometimes sits, and lets the place be what it is. "You're here," she says once, not expecting a reply. The flag remains folded at home. The glove stays on the shelf. Objects, finally allowed to be objects again. I can't pretend I know what it means to finish a search that outlived almost everyone who began it. What I can see is how knowing where someone rests does not restore conversations, but it does restore proportion. A life no longer floats between codes and paperwork. It settles. There are other markers still bearing letters instead of names. Other drawers holding unanswered mail. This story closed administratively, but not emotionally, and perhaps that is the truest ending it can offer. A man came home. Time did not.